Hello and welcome to the Peace Talk, this time with David North. David North is an American author, activist, and scholar. He's active in the Trotsky movement for more than 50 years. He served as the national secretary for the Socialist Equality Party in the United States. He played an important role in shaping the International Committee of the Fourth International. He's the chairman of the International Editorial Board of the World Socialist website. He published several books and articles. Dear David, I thank you very much for your time, and I'm very glad and honored that you followed my invitation for this interview.
I'm glad to be here.
So let me begin with a more personal question. As always, I'm curious about how people get involved in politics and what motivates them, drives them. You know, do you want to change the world, or what is your motivation to get in politics, to study history and let's start with that question.
Well, I am part of the generation which was initially politically radicalized by the events of the 1960s. At least the proximate cause of the radicalization of my generation was, of course, Vietnam. In the United States, the massive civil rights struggles, the growing anger at the policies pursued by the United States internationally. That was a generational experience, but I think there were deeper causes which are important to keep in mind in understanding not just why I became radicalized and actually turned to Marxism and ultimately to Trotskyism, but it was a broader experience of the generation of which I was a part. What I think conditioned the response of my generation, those who were in their teens in the 1960s, I was myself born in 1950, was that we were part of a generation that was viewing the events taking place in our youth within the framework of what we were learning and had known through our families often and through our associations of what had happened even before we were born, particularly the Second World War and the First World War. The Second World War was the war through which our parents' generation had passed. The First World War was the war through which our grandparents had passed. And the literature, the films which influenced us in our youth were very much colored by these things. We read as children All Quiet on the Western Front, or Barbuse's book Le Feu. We saw films such as King and Country. There were many anti-war films which familiarized ourselves with the brutality and senselessness of the wars which had killed millions. Then, of course, there was the experience of the Second World War, the growing realization that that war had been accompanied by or had been pursued with a level of barbarism such as the world had never seen, that fascism was the product of imperialism, of capitalism. And in fact, it was through the prism of these historical experiences that I think my generation viewed the war in Vietnam and other atrocities being carried out by imperialism, the wars to suppress genuine national liberation movements, the struggles against colonial oppression, the developments in South Africa, of course, the war in Algeria. All of this was viewed through the prism of a realization that the crimes being committed by contemporary governments were a continuation of what had occurred in the years and decades before our birth. So I think to understand what imparted such a intense level of political radicalization, it was the historical context. You know, many youth of my generation would spell America with a K, and that was, of course, an allusion to a Germanic spelling. Of course, it wasn't politically precise, but in fact, there was a very great feeling that the atrocities that the United States was perpetrating in Vietnam were a continuation of the atrocities of the Nazis. And I think that was a universal experience. And that was, I certainly saw the world in that way. Now, what brought me then to socialism and ultimately Trotskyism? Well, of course, first of all, a ever greater disillusionment with bourgeois politics, the politics of the Democratic Party, which claimed to be a progressive political party, but it was in fact ever more clearly a party of corporate interests. It was the Democratic Party which was waging the war in Vietnam. And then as one turned to socialism, the question arose, well, what was socialism? Who represented socialism? Of course, commonly, the Soviet Union was portrayed as a socialist country. Now, I was sympathetic to the extent that I understood what the Russian Revolution was. I was certainly sympathetic to the aspirations of the Soviet Union. I was aware that there had been a great revolution. Even those who were not, except those on the extreme right, but even those who were liberal or left would acknowledge that the October Revolution was a colossal event in world history, that Lenin was a political genius. And of course, we understood that the Soviet Union had played a monumental role and the decisive role in the defeat of Nazi Germany. And nevertheless, I certainly recognized that the Soviet Union had a dictatorial government. I knew something of the terror that had existed in the 1930s. And to the extent that, and this was the argument always made, however progressive a revolution may have been, however well-intentioned its aspirations, revolutions must degenerate, revolutions lead to dictatorship. You know, books like Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler were read, or Orwell's 1984, or Animal Farm, which presented in one form or another the Stalinist regime as the inevitable outcome of revolution. And to the extent that one believed that, one was reluctant to accept a revolutionary response to the crimes of capitalism, if all that it would produce was another dictatorship. However, in this very critical period of my development, and I must say this was again a social experience, I came across a remarkable biography of Leon Trotsky by Isaac Deutscher. There was 3 volumes: The Prophet Armed, which took the life of Trotsky to 1921, The Prophet Unarmed, which told the story of Trotsky's loss of power in the Soviet Union, and finally The Prophet Outcast, which is a story of the last 11 years of his life in exile, culminating in his assassination in 1940. Now, this book was, despite many of the weaknesses which I came to detect in terms of its interpretation of Trotsky's politics, particularly in relationship to the Fourth International, it was a book which destroyed and exposed the lies of the Stalinist regime. It introduced me and many of my generation to the writings of Leon Trotsky, and that had a profound effect on my intellectual and, of course, political development. I came to recognize that Trotsky explained the causes of the degeneration of the Soviet Union, that it was not inevitable, that there had been a powerful opposition to Stalinism within the USSR. That opposition had been subjected to horrifying repression and was ultimately destroyed, that the terror was not some senseless, revolution devouring its children, but it was the response of a bureaucratic regime seeking to preserve its privileges against the working class, against the genuine revolutionary forces within the USSR, and that the basis of that counter-revolution was a rejection of the fundamental perspective of the October Revolution, which was the perspective of world socialist revolution. The October Revolution was not primarily a national event, however important it was in the history of Russia, but it was above all a world event. It signified the beginning of a world socialist revolution. That was the perspective of Lenin, and it was, of course, the perspective of Trotsky. And when one understood that, and one had an explanation of the causes, both of the an explanation of the causes of the degeneration of the USSR, and a recognition of the very real possibility of an alternative, well, that changed one's political views towards socialism. It was on that basis that I became a conscious socialist. I became involved in the revolutionary movement, which is to say, I became active in a party which was then known as the Workers' League, now the Socialist Equality Party, which was in political solidarity with the International Committee of the Fourth International. So that, in a very concise way, I hope, is an explanation of how I came to politics.
Why liberalism didn't draw your attention that much? For example, if you read Steven Pinker, you get the impression that everything is fine, everything is working fast, we get better and better, progress is everywhere, technological, health and medicine. And if you read Samuel Huntington and Francis Fukuyama, The End of History, you get the impression that there is no fight going on, and we live in a happy, liberal, capitalist world. Consumer are happy. We can buy hamburgers. And,
well, as far as Mr. Pinker, Dr. Pinker is concerned, I think Voltaire wrote about him in the 18th century, a certain novel known as Candide. We live in the best of all possible worlds. Well, I think Dr. Pinker is deluding himself, and I don't see how one can draw that conclusion, given the fact that we have passed through a century of unspeakable violence. I know he argues that he tries to prove in some way or another that that's not the case, or that we have in the last 30 years since the end of the Soviet Union witnessed staggering levels of violence, both through war, through the everyday violence of massive poverty, the immiseration of broader sections of the population, and in fact, right now, a pandemic, which in the course of the past 3 years has killed over 20 million people. That's a form of class war, because it was deaths that could have been avoided. As for the others, I mean, Samuel Huntington is the late Samuel Huntington defended a utterly racist view of history, which posits racial and ethnic hatred as a driving force of history. And as far as Fukuyama is concerned, and I replied to him in a book that I wrote, upon the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, or in the late 1980s when he first advanced this thesis, he said that the end of the Soviet Union was the end of history, by which he meant that man had reached, in the form of bourgeois democracy, liberal bourgeois democracy, the highest point attainable by civilization. That socialism, the supposed alternative to liberal capitalism, had decisively failed. And if man had learned anything, this was as good as it would ever get. Again, underlying this interpretation of the unfinished, of the end of history, was the identification of Stalinism with Marxism and socialism, which is fundamentally false. But it was, as we have seen, a devastating misconception of reality. We didn't arrive at the end of history. History was very much continuing. A similar conception to that of Fukuyama was advanced by the British historian, longtime Stalinist, Eric Hobsbawm, in which his argument, which was a variation of Fukuyama's really, was that the 20th century was a short century. It began in 1914 with the outbreak of World War I. It ended in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. From his standpoint, the October Revolution was an aberration, an accidental historical event, never to be repeated. Socialism was impossible. Mankind was now living in internal darkness. But the 20th century was defined by World War I, the October Revolution. The October Revolution failed. It failed because it had to fail. There was no alternative. In response to Hobsbawm and to Fukuyama, I counterposed to the end of history and the short 20th century the concept of the unfinished 20th century. Far from being a short century, the 21st century really is a continuation and is confronted with very much the same problems and the same issues that faced mankind in 1914, or that is the contradictions, the fundamental economic and social contradictions that gave rise to the twin events of World War I and the October Revolution are the same contradictions which are driving history today. And they are the conflict between the national state system and the growth of world economy, which cannot be reconciled, which leads inevitably toward war and to a revolution. One of the striking characteristics of our time, when we look back over the 20th century and we read about World War I, or for that matter, the politics of that period, which was centered largely on the conflict between capitalist parties and socialist parties, the language of that period is fundamentally the same as the language we use today. You can read newspaper accounts of politics, diplomacy, internal politics, and the phraseology and the terminology they use are the same as the terminology we use today. The writings of Lenin, the writings of Trotsky, are instantaneously recognizable. I make this point because if you were to be in 1914 reading the documents of 1814, it was a different language. It was a profoundly different time. That's not the case today. You want to understand the war in Ukraine, you have to understand World War I, the contradictions underlying the politics of Central Europe, Eastern Europe, the Russian Revolution, the massive social, national conflicts of that period, or for that matter, the politics of the Second World War. The political forces which are dominant in Ukraine today have their origins very much in the 1930s in the nationalist fascistic movements which dominated bourgeois national politics in Ukraine. And for that matter, the war in Ukraine is very much a product of the dissolution of the USSR. Let us keep in mind that the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which ultimately is a proxy war instigated by NATO, but the two major combatants both are entities which arise out of the dissolution of the USSR. So again, to make the claim that we are living in the best of all possible worlds under conditions of war, pandemic, massive social dislocations, tens of millions of people made refugees, declining living standards. It requires a credible level of, I think, complacency, not to mention a blindness.
Yeah, focusing only on the global north and the
I mean, what they say, what they're really
easy.
saying, if I can make this point, Joseph, they're very happy with their own stock portfolios. That seems to be the major preoccupation of a large number of academics employed by think tanks and given huge salaries far greater than those of the teaching assistants. And they're very happy with the way things are. But them being happy is not the masses being happy. A very, very different mood prevails among the broad masses of the population.
I totally agree. There is a lot of division in the left-wing movements, but also in the theories. You mentioned Marxism. Then I saw, for example, there are many intellectuals and scholars who, call themselves neo-Marxist. Then there are post-Marxist, for example, here in Vienna, we have Oliver Machat, for example, who is a post-Marxist from the Essex School, Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe. Then there are orthodox Marxists. There are before the interview, when we talked, I mentioned the Antideutsche. They also call themselves Marxist. If they are, this is up to the debate. But and even the Stalinist regime, I believe, referred to Marxism in some sense. And so what is Marxism? Because everybody is interpreting it in a different way, and it culminates, and this is only Marxism, when we get other left ideas, for example, postmodernist, post-structuralist like Foucault, Derrida, Lyotard, and so on. Then when we get the anarchism with the different, there is confusion, and there is so many theories that are trying to explain oppression, war, but isn't it so simple? There are people in power who want to stay in power. I mean, why do we need all these debates and theories to understand? I'm curious.
Well, first of all, just Marx said way back in the 19th century, in Engels, that you don't judge a man by what he says about himself, and you can't judge political parties simply at what they say about themselves. People can call themselves whatever they want, but you have to examine their programs, their historical evolution. To know something is to know the historical process out of which it emerged. And all the different tendencies you speak of have, even if they aren't very clear on it themselves, a political background, political history. They have an intellectual history, and they have, of course, social interests, which can be identified through the nature of the program that they advance. Now, all the many different tendencies you referred to, let me just to be clear, when you talk about the anti-Deutsch, I don't want to spend time on them. This is not a socialist movement. It is not a left movement. It is a group of right-wing provocateurs, and they have nothing to do with socialism whatsoever, Marxism. But if you look at many of the different tendencies which claim to be on the left, you mentioned whether it's Chantal Mouffe, or you talk about the Frankfurt School, the postmodernists, all of these in different ways were reactions of sections of the intelligentsia to the defeats of the working class in the 1930s and 1940s. And over time, more and more adopted the perspective that social revolution is impossible, and that the revolutionary subject upon which Marxism concentrated, that is the working class, was not a revolutionary force. And that, in fact, the concentration which Marxism focused on the working class was fundamentally wrong. For example, if you look at the politics of Mouffe and Laclau, they very much, with their conceptions of sort of a left populism, very specifically repudiated the Marxist concentration on the working class. And Marxism, socialism, is concentrated on one really fundamental question. That is the revolutionary conquest of power by the working class, which is objectively the revolutionary force in capitalist society. In one form or another, all the tendencies which you referenced rejected that. And that underlies their conception that the Marxist project itself has failed. It attributed a revolutionary role to a social force that is not revolutionary. And again, related to that perspective is a failure and a refusal to really investigate in any serious way the causes of the defeats of socialism in the 20th century. There was no shortage of revolutionary movements and revolutionary uprisings by the working class. What so many tendencies, or those that came to break with Marxism, concluded from these defeats was that the fault for these defeats lay with the working class itself. What they all chose to ignore is the decisive issue. What was the role of those organizations, those parties that were in the leadership of the working class? What was the role of Stalinism, first and foremost, in the defeat of the working class in Germany, or the defeat of the working class in the Chinese Revolution in 1927, or the defeat of the Spanish Revolution? What was the role of social democracy, which capitulated to fascism, which allied itself with imperialism again and again, and became ultimately, as it is today, a complete appendage of imperialist politics? What were the role of the trade unions? What were the role of the anarchist movements, particularly in Spain? How did these organizations, in one way or another, through their policies, through the influence which they exerted in the working class, lead to defeats? Now, the Trotskyist movement analyzed these processes, fought against these defeats, and when Trotsky founded the Fourth International in 1933, or issued, first of all, his call for the Fourth International, he did so on the basis of, as a response to the greatest defeat the working class had ever suffered, the defeat in Germany and the coming to power of Hitler. And the principal responsibility for that defeat lay in the policies of the German Communist Party and the Communist International dominated by the Stalinists. They had put forward the policy of social fascism. They opposed the unification of working class struggles against the Nazis. They took the position that social democracy and fascism were identical. They ignored and turned their back on the millions of German workers who were still organized within the social democratic movement, and cleared the path for power. And not only that, after this defeat, insisted that the policies that they had carried out were correct. That's when Trotsky called for the Fourth International. A whole series of subsequent events in Spain, in France, also resulting in defeat, led Trotsky to write in the founding document of the Fourth International, which was officially founded in 1938, that the crisis of mankind is the crisis of revolutionary leadership. That, as he said, the greatest problem confronting the social revolution was not the absence of objective possibilities of revolution. There were no shortage of opportunities. The great unsolved problem was one of political leadership. Now, Trotsky believed that this problem could be solved. Of course, its solution has proven to be a very protracted problem. And it's within the framework of the struggles over that issue, resolving the crisis of working class leadership, that the history of the Fourth International has emerged. The tendency with which I am associated, the International Committee of the Fourth International, is itself the outcome of a very protracted struggle among organizations which at different times claimed to be Trotskyists, but fundamentally broke with the perspective of the upon which the Fourth International was founded. I could go into that at some length very, very briefly. The first and most fundamental split when the Fourth International took place over, first of all, the rejection of Trotsky's identification of the Soviet Union as a degenerated worker state, the rejection, the claim made by Shachtman and Burnham in the 1939-40 that the Soviet Union was just another capitalist power, which was false. Then in the late 1940s and 1950s, the argument that Stalinism could, through pressure applied by the working class, be transformed into a revolutionary force. The International Committee emerged in opposition to the attempt to attribute to Stalinism a potentially revolutionary role. The position of the Trotskyist movement, as founded by Trotsky, was that Stalinism was counter-revolutionary, and that unless the bureaucracy was overthrown in a political revolution, the Soviet Union would be ultimately liquidated by the bureaucracy, and that is what ultimately happened. The Soviet Union was dissolved by the bureaucracy, which introduced capitalism back into the Soviet Union with devastating consequences, of which the present war is a particularly tragic product.
Absolutely. And I wonder how we should deal with this division, not only theoretical, but on a practical level, in order to change society, in order to make a more egalitarian and just society. We need to overcome these differences. I mean, I spoke a few days ago with Boaventura de Sousa Santos, and he, in a lecture, mentioned, for example, and also in the interview, that there is this division. For example, there are feminists who are not anti-capitalist, or they are, I don't know, anti-capitalists, but racists, and so on and so forth. So we need this, you know, and with the debate of intersectionalism and so on, here we are more divided than ever, because now I can claim I'm a feminist, and your struggle of the working struggle, the peasantry or the workers or proletarian struggle, this is not my struggle because I'm a feminist. And now we are more divided than ever. So how to overcome this struggle, but at the same time respect that there are many different forms of oppression, racism, you know, misogyny, sexism, and so on. So how to fight one or both or many at the same time, or how to deal with these problems?
Well, I think in answering this, I can't help but speak at a somewhat more fundamental level. There's a basic misconception, which is very common, that political differences are all the product of misunderstandings. And why can't people just put aside their petty differences, everyone get together? But political divisions have a more complex character. They are not just differences between individuals, people with generally this good ideas and good intentions. These divisions have deep social roots. They reflect different class interests. What you referred to, intersectionality, those who emphasize race, emphasize different forms of identity. These are all in one way or another essentially movements of the middle class. They all are founded on what I was speaking about before, the rejection of the independent revolutionary role of the working class. The Marxist movement emerged as a struggle to develop within the working class, which was an emerging social class at the time, and since has become the overwhelming mass of society, but to develop in the working class an understanding of its objective interests. Now, in the course of that long struggle for political self-consciousness, which the Marxist movement seeks to introduce into the working class, to assist the workers in becoming aware, becoming class conscious, understanding what their interests are, it has normally had to conduct a very protracted and complicated, and in fact bitter struggle against the influence of the bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeoisie, which strive to subordinate the working class to its own interests. Now, when we analyze the nature of capitalist society, the fundamental divisions that exist within society are those of class, not race. That's a false, entirely false category. The so-called gender issues are themselves laden with totally different class interests. A female wage worker does not have the same social interests as a woman in the upper middle class. And in fact, if you examine very carefully the politics of many of these movements, what do they really represent? In our view, they represent the interests of relatively affluent sections of the middle class who gaze longingly at the wealth of the extreme rich and would like to have a better distribution of all the money sloshing around at the top of society among a more broader section of the upper middle class. The demand, therefore, is for affirmative action, hire more women, hire more blacks. And so if you look at American television, you will see that this is being done, and those very, very small layers among the minorities who attain these positions, who get multi-million-dollar salaries, are no less reactionary than their counterparts among whites or so on. I mean, these are not the real divisions in society. The divisions in society are between classes. The working class, which is an international class, and the bourgeoisie, and those layers in the upper middle class which are close to it. Now, as far as us all getting together, almost all the tendencies which you referred to are ferocious in their support of the Ukraine war. What we call the pseudo-left, and that's what they are. They promote the war in Ukraine. They align themselves with imperialism. Our party has been criticized because we oppose this war, and we explain its origins. And our approach as internationalists, we oppose the instigation of this war by imperialism, and we oppose the essentially reactionary response of the Putin regime. Our policy is not a national policy, it's an international policy. But our opposition to imperialism has been denounced by Gilbert Ashkar, for example, who is the leader of the, what we refer to the Pavlovite pseudo-left movement. He refers to knee-jerk anti-imperialism. They align themselves in support of imperialist war against Russia, imperialist war against the Soviet, against China, and there can be no unity with such people. So you see, these are not, we're going to say it, these are not misunderstandings. There are real, profound class divisions, programmatic divisions, which cannot be reconciled by calling everybody to just get together. We want to unify the working class. That struggle for the unification of the working class requires overcoming the influence of racial politics, ethnic politics, gender politics, and so on, and to strive for workers in every part of the world to recognize, regardless of their nationality, their common international solidarity. Moreover, and I think this is fundamental in our period, struggles themselves are objectively of an international character. The working class confronts internationally organized capital. Finance capital is global. Production is global, not national. In any given factory in the world, workers assemble parts which are produced by labor organized all over the world. To fight international capital, the working class must conduct its struggle as a consciously international class. And that, I must say, is yet another reason why the Trotskyist movement, with its perspective of world socialist revolution, is the genuine Marxism of our age.
I understand you. And Nancy Fraser described it by, I believe she talked about the progressive neoliberalism, that in this sense, corporations co-opted left labels, left struggles, and they framed it in their own way. But my question is more, how can we transform society if we cannot reach these people? I mean, I had many different interviews with queer feminists and feminist scholars who also tackle capitalism and Absolutely. So I believe their struggle is also our struggle, and we have to find common grounds in order to, to transform the society. And even, I believe, even the left wing in worker unions and even social democratic movements, we should align, in order to transform.
But again, Joseph, doesn't one have to look at the real social essence of these questions? Let us take the question, since you raised homosexuality. Well, of course, this is a significant democratic question. Everyone should have a democratic right to establish personal relations which correspond to their own sexual orientation. That is a democratic right, which is unconditional. And yet, democratic questions in our epoch can only be resolved and secured through the struggle for socialism. As we can see in the present period, basic democratic rights are under assault at every level. A fundamental conception of Trotsky, the theory of, in fact, the foundational conception of the theory of permanent revolution, is that in the epoch of imperialism, the democratic tasks can only be resolved are inseparably connected to and dependent upon the organization of the working class in the struggle for socialism. The working class resolves the disputed or democratic issues, or the democratic demands which are under assault, the democratic rights which are under assault. They secure them with the conquest of power by the working class and the abolition of capitalism, which is the source, ultimately, of the attack on all these democratic rights. So the attempt to separate the issue of democracy from the question of socialism immediately discloses the class interests of those who tried to make that separation. There's a long history to this. In one of the earlier documents in the foundational period of Marxism, in Marx and Engels' famous circular to the Communist League, they made the point that the bourgeois Democrats and the petty bourgeois Democrats largely seek or understand revolution as a way of making life more comfortable for them. And as soon as they achieve their objectives, they abandon the working class. The working class is the genuine revolutionary class because the struggle for its liberation is the liberation of all humanity. And that great fundamental truth acquires immense significance in our own age. We are living at a time when I think anyone who is thoughtful can recognize the survival of the planet is in question. We've all been following on this. You just related to me shortly before we began this discussion. The heat wave in Europe, there is no doubt that global warming is a reality. Only sort of the anti-science Neanderthals will deny this. But nothing can be done of a serious character under capitalism. We have lived through a pandemic and we're still in its grip. Millions have died. Life expectancy has been shortened. And we see official indifference and toward this scourge. Nothing is being done. And then we are confronted with a war which at any point can escalate into a nuclear catastrophe. That is what we're facing. And even before the end of war, even before global warming does its catastrophic work, we could have a thermonuclear war which results in the extermination of the population. Now, how is this to be stopped? It can be stopped in no other way except through the overthrow of capitalism. And the only social force which can actually accomplish that task is the global working class. That is the fundamental question of our time. And so the attempt to sort of separate all these different issues from the fundamental question of the economic organization of society, they are really false solutions, and they reflect the interests. These false solutions reflect the very limited aims of different sections of the middle class. These middle class interests then find their ideological expression and political expression in one or another political movement. So I think if you look at it this way, one tends to get away from the idea that political differences are all the product of misunderstandings and we can all get together, and rather they're understood in a more profound sense as ideological and political forms determined by real objective social divisions within society. Mouffe and Leclerc represent the interests of different factions of the middle class who oppose building a movement based on the working class. And by the way, I'll just make one further point on this. All the names you're mentioning, what involvement do they have in the actual struggles of the working class? What struggles are they seeking to lead? What answers do they have in terms of the real struggles of the working class? What involvement do they have? As far as I can see it, they have no involvement whatsoever. So the movement which we're building is a movement which is oriented both in its theory and in its practice to the working class. We strive to establish the political authority of our movement through our interventions in the working class and a continuous fight to develop the class consciousness of the working class, to introduce into the working class Marxist theory, to transform the working class, if I can use the terminology, from a class in itself into a class for itself. And that is the essential work upon which our movement is concentrated. That's why we publish the World Socialist website. So I said to you before, it is the most widely read socialist publication in the world, and of course the one which is hardly ever even referred to in the bourgeois media. But every day we publish, every day, and we explain the events of the day in a broader historical context and assist the more advanced sections of workers to understand the nature of the struggle through which they are passing. So we are deeply involved and embedded in the struggles of the working class. That's the force in which we seek to build our movement.
I totally understand you, and I came from anarcho-syndicalist movements, and here I totally am, there are two hearts beating in my chest. One heart is the anarcho-syndicalist movement, who is also fighting for the working class. But then there is also Michel Foucault in my heart, and
why? May I ask you why? What is the message of Foucault to the working class? I'll give you my explanation, but let me exercise my privileges
with Foucault. Foucault opened my mind of how power works, and his concept of biopolitics is great in order to understand because Gramsci initiated to answer this question, but he couldn't fully grasp it, and Foucault answered the problem of Gramsci. How is power conciliated, consolidate, and how is it that people do not understand that they are in power relations and that they are oppressed? And ask a Austrian middle class worker, he is not oppressed. And so here comes Foucault into play, and with Foucault you understand that biopolitics, the power structure, has also a positive effect. For example, they care about you, health system, blah blah blah, all these narratives. This is an instrument, a powerful instrument, in order and people get the impression, oh, the state is there for me, and capitalism works for me. And so, but anyways, what I wanted to say is there are two hearts beating in my chest, and the other heart with Foucault is questioning this narrative of working class, because what is the objective interest of a German industrial worker, for example, working for Rheinmetall, the biggest weapon producer in Germany, and soon in Europe? What has it also in common with, for example, Bulgarian or let's go even further, a Philippine, Malaysian worker? Nothing. They have nothing in common nowadays. I'm talking about now. So the German industrial worker is profiting from this imperialist system and from capitalist division of labor. So yeah, I believe that there is no common objective in this capitalist system.
Well, just I'll reply to you, but first of all, let me just make the point about Foucault. I mean, he is an irrationalist. He absolutely rejects the concept of an objective truth, which is a characteristic element of virtually all great many bourgeois philosophical tendencies, anti-Marxist tendencies. The other major postmodernist thinker, Lyotard, was very clear on this. His so-called rejection of grand narratives, that is the possibility of a scientific, objectively true explanation of the contradictions that exist in society. Socialism is just one narrative. Everyone has his own narrative. There is no objective truth upon which practice can be based. This has its roots in the supremely irrationalist philosophy and reactionary philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, who, by the way, when his initial reception, there were intellectuals who were under the mistaken idea or influenced by the mistaken conception that he was some sort of left philosopher. He was nothing of the sort. The very deeply reactionary implications of Nietzsche's irrationalism became ever clearer, particularly with the development of the World War I and the revolutionary struggles of the 20th century. Now, as for the statement you make, and it's really, Joseph, nothing more than an assertion. You say, what is the objective connection between a worker in the Philippines or the worker in Sri Lanka or a worker in Western Europe? Well, they are organized in a global capitalist economy. They share and they are part of an exploitative system. They sell their labor power objectively to powerful corporations which extract from their labor surplus value and profit. They undergo a common form of social economic exploitation. They are an oppressed class. And that fundamental reality is the driving force of a social struggle that is apparent throughout the world. The class struggle is a global movement. Workers today, whether they are in Germany or in Singapore or in the United States, generally find themselves fighting very frequently the same organization. And at any rate, as I said before, they are often they are generally engaged in a production process which is global in its operation. Their surplus value, the surplus value they produce, is appropriated by transnational corporations which operate on a world scale. And so to make the claim that they have nothing in common is simply to ignore, I think, the essential nature of modern society. I mean, the capitalism which Marx described was in its diapers. The capitalism which exists today is the outcome of a vast, massive development of the objective tendencies that were first analyzed by Marx and Engels. And their statement from 1847, the working class, the workers of the world unite that has a relevance to our present society as it has in no previous period in history. The capitalist system has established itself throughout the world, and wherever it comes into existence, it brings with it a massive growth of the working class. I'll just make this point, back in the 60s, it was very common to counterpose to the working class, say, well, the mass of the world is peasantry, and what is the relevance of, and in fact, they would say, well, Marxism never really established itself in the working class. It became more of a peasant movement and so on, based on the influence of Maoism, which was itself a retrograde reaction against Marxism. But today, if I would look at what are the most profound changes that I've witnessed in my lifetime, we have seen a staggering globalization of the productive process, the emergence of massive working classes in areas of the world which, when I was in my teens, it didn't really exist. There are the largest cities within a decade or so will be in Africa: Kinshasa, Mombasa, Nairobi. These are cities which have massive proletariats. The proletariat of South America, in Sao Paulo, in Santiago, or in any Lima, any major city in Latin America has a multi-million proletariat. And so we are, and I've read strategic journals produced by various bourgeois think tanks, and they express their alarm over this reality of a massive urbanized working class, which they foresee will be a revolutionary force. This is a massive concern of the bourgeoisie. So I think most of these theories which you're reciting bear no relationship to objective economic reality. The working class in the United States is a part of an international class. And workers are more and more recognizing this. We're involved in many struggles, and we always bring to the attention of workers the necessity for workers to establish international contact. We have formed, as a matter of fact, the International Workers Alliance of Rank and File Committees to assist in the coordination of social strike struggles on a global scale. There are many strikes which we have been engaged in which we immediately contact workers, rank and file workers in different countries, and they see at once the underlying solidarity and also the similar problems. When the role of the trade unions in every country is the same, the bureaucracies suppress working class struggles, they subordinate the working class to the corporations. This is a global experience. So the claim, really frankly, Joseph, the claim that workers have nothing in common is contradicted by reality. They have everything in common. What's different? Housing prices, cost of living, unemployment, pandemic, the threat of war. Aren't these global questions? Aren't these questions which require a unified response by the working class? Mustn't the workers understand that they must, in fact, unify and overthrow the global capitalist system? That's the central reality of our time.
Yeah, I agree. But my point was that the German worker is profiting more from the global system, and he is less incentive, he's less motivated to change the system because the system...
Why do you say that? May I just ask, on what basis do you say that? The workers
I see
Germany, und Sie wissen, ich bin ziemlich bekannt mit Deutschland. Just making this point. Where the German worker is facing the destruction of their living standards. In the last year, in the interests of this horrifying war in Ukraine, the German ruling class, back to its old tricks, has tripled its military budget. Everything is being subordinated once again to war. So how can that there exists a relative differences in wage levels, but if you look at it from the standpoint of the actual cost of living, the decline in living standards among broad sections of the European working class is horrific. And we've seen in France, just in the last 6 weeks, or actually longer, massive social movements against Macron, uprisings, and millions of people have gone into the streets. So why is there this tendency just to dismiss this and then to say, well, these are just reactionary, they have nothing in common with workers anywhere else in the world? I don't think that's correct. I think that's an incorrect way of looking at it. And that's why, you know, when you say you agree, I think if you look at this somewhat critically, what happens with these different type of middle class ideologies, they falsify social reality and create immense confusion and undermine the actual striving, which is so critical for unity. Now, if you said workers don't clearly understand their common interests, yes, that's true. That's what we have to overcome. That is why we have to overcome the insidious influence of nationalism, of ethnic politics, identity politics, all of these different forms of bourgeois or petty bourgeois ideologies, which conceal and falsify and distort objective social reality.
Absolutely, yes. And like you said, the working class is also fighting the wars. It's not the Russian or Ukrainian oligarchs who are fighting now. So yeah, I see that. I see your point. Absolutely, yes. Maybe we can one last, because we spoke about theories and so on and so forth. You also mentioned Austromarxism and all the left ideas or theories that are against an uprising, that had fear of a revolution. Why is it that people are afraid of change? I mean, they see that there is oppression. They see that, okay, climate crisis and many other things. I mean, okay, Otto Bauer didn't have the same problems like we had. But why are they so afraid of change?
Well, I think it's very interesting that you mentioned Otto Bauer. I mean, that defines, what was Marxism? It was a very, very finished ideological expression of the efforts of social democracy to remove revolution from the agenda. I mean, Austromarxism, its social significance came out of the experience of the First World War, which produced the fundamental split in the Marxist movement between reformism, which rejected the revolutionary struggle of the working class, the dictatorship of the proletariat, which opposed the October Revolution, which had allied itself with its own bourgeoisie in war, and which its fundamental opposition to the Marxism, I think the genuine Marxism, which was defended by Lenin, Trotsky, which set as its aim the overthrow of capitalism and the organization of the working class for that purpose. By the way, if you hear the noise in the background, I will just tell you what that is. We are also suffering the effect of the very tumultuous weather patterns this summer. And so while we've been speaking, if it all suddenly became very dark and I had to turn on lights, it's because a massive storm is breaking out, and we even are getting tornado warnings.
Wow. Okay.
In Detroit, which is unusual. So hopefully this won't disrupt our interview, but I wanted you and your listeners to know what's actually taking place outside. But no, Otto Bauer, Austromarxism was what Trotsky called it, a reformist falsification of Marxism, and its tragic consequences were to be seen in the destruction of the workers' movement in Austria, You had, I believe, a powerful working class uprising in 1927. In 1934, the coming to power of a sort of Austromarxism cleared the path, for Austrofascism. And Otto Bauer himself wound up living in exile and dying in Paris. Hilferdink, another significant representative of Austromarxism, wound up in a torture chamber of the Gestapo. A catastrophic misconception based on the idea that the path to socialism was through the gradual perfection of democracy and reforms. That was false.
And my next question is also related because I'm a big fan of Rosa Luxemburg, and she combined both ideas, I believe, and I don't know if she coined it like this or maybe I got it from a different theoretician, but anyways, this radical reformation. So she wanted to change the system from inside and from outside at the same time. So this is some sort of revolution, but yeah.
Well, I've read Rosa Luxemburg. I admire her greatly. As I think she once said, she and Clara Zetkin were the only two men in German social democracy. She was a revolutionist. She opposed the war. She opposed it on a revolutionary basis. And the more recent efforts to portray Rosa Luxemburg as some sort of tender-hearted humanist is just a distortion of both her personality and her politics. I mean, she was an intransigent opponent of the reformist tendency within the German social democracy. She played a major role in the fight against Bernstein. She wrote one of her first great polemical works was called Reform or Revolution, in which she insisted that the path to socialism was not through the gradual reform and perfection of bourgeois democracy, but through its revolutionary overthrow by the working class. That was her politics. And ultimately, she broke decisively with the social democracy and was a founder of the German Communist Party. And that was the reason why she was murdered with the connivance of the social democracy in January 1919. But Rosa Luxemburg was one of the great revolutionary figures of the 20th century, and she speaks as well to our time. Her aim was always to infuse the growing mass movement of the working class with a true consciousness of its historical task, to direct the spontaneous movement along revolutionary socialist lines. And I think that element of Rosa Luxemburg retains enormous significance for our lifetime. And I wanted to raise, if I can, earlier, you did raise with me in an earlier discussion or pre-discussion about the relevance of Trotsky, and my most recent book is entitled Leon Trotsky and the Struggle for Socialism in the 21st Century. And the point I want to make when we survey the history of the socialist movement, and no doubt the two colossal figures of socialism in the last century were Lenin, the leader of the Bolshevik Party, and Trotsky, who played a fundamental role in the victory of the October Revolution, the building of the Red Army. But what Trotsky did in the aftermath of Lenin's death, in the founding of the left opposition, in the struggle he waged against Stalinism, in his analysis of the contradictions of capitalism that led to the Second World War, all of these were to impart to his development of Marxism an astonishingly contemporary character. I think this is why, when we speak of the rebirth of socialism in the 21st century, the basis of that rebirth will be the writings of Trotsky. Trotsky is the most contemporary of all the great Marxist writers. As you can hear, we are now having hail. We're in the midst of a hailstorm. So I think our discussion has had a very momentous character to it. The heavens are commenting on it. You have to put on your sound system.
Sorry. My question was, what is the relation between Lenin and Trotsky? What is the differences that they had? And for example, because I believe Trotsky, I read it somewhere, did criticize the Bolshevik leaders and was also criticizing Lenin at some point. What are the theoretical differences? And maybe on a personal level, what are the relation the relationship?
Well, the history of Lenin, the relationship of Lenin and Trotsky is one of the great political relations of history. Trotsky came under the influence of Lenin very early in his political life, in his early 20s, and he went to London at the age of 22, 23 in 1902. It's a famous encounter. He arrived in London after having escaped from exile. He passed through Vienna at that time. He actually met with Victor Adler first, then went on to London and went to Lenin's apartment early in the morning and began discussions. And Lenin immediately recognized that this was a remarkable young man and invited Trotsky to write for what was then the important social democratic newspaper, Iskra. And in 1902, 1903, that was Trotsky's major work. He also lectured at Lenin's urging in the European continent. Then the famous 1903 Congress took place, which led to the historic split in the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party between two factions, which came to be known as Bolshevik and Menshevik. The implications of that split, or all the political reasons for that split, were not immediately clear. They would emerge over time. But Trotsky initially aligned himself organizationally, and for a very brief period with the Mensheviks. He objected to Lenin's proposals to change the editorial board of Iskra. But underlying Trotsky's difference at that time was his objection to Lenin's insistence that those elements which he were identified with the Menshevik movement represented and would come to represent the fundamental break with Marxism, and that the building of a revolutionary party proceeded very much through a relentless struggle against the forms of opportunism, political, organizational, represented by the Menshevik tendency. Trotsky devoted the 10 years after the split very much to attempting to effect a reunification of all tendencies within the social democracy. There was another, so on the organizational question, Trotsky, for a long period of time, did not recognize or understand the deeper political implications of the struggle that Lenin was waging against opportunist tendencies. Lenin, it must be said, viewed the inner party struggle as something of a laboratory of the class struggle, in which the analysis of divisions revealed different social interests, and the education of the working class very much proceeded through the continuous progressive undermining of opportunist influence within the working class movement. And he showed that this was connected to profound political questions, that the Mensheviks, their organizational opportunism, was very much bound up with a political orientation to the liberal bourgeoisie. That would become all too clear in the course of the First World War and certainly in 1917. But there was another issue which underlay the difference between Lenin and Trotsky, and that was their basic assessment of the character of the coming Russian Revolution. This is a very complicated question, and it goes to the fundamental issues raised by Trotsky in his theory of permanent revolution. In brief, Lenin fought for the political independence of the working class, and he foresaw that a revolution in Russia would lead to something he called the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. And that formulation left unclear the precise class character of the state and government that was to emerge from the revolution. Trotsky argued that in the modern epoch, the working class, in attempting to resolve the unresolved democratic issues, for example, the land question, the destruction of feudal forms of property, and so on, would not be able to stop the overthrow of the Tsarist autocracy, would not be able to stop at democratic demands. It would not transfer power to the bourgeoisie, but rather would have to take power into its own hands with the support of the peasantry. So he foresaw that the Russian Revolution would acquire a socialistic character, that having overthrown the Tsar, the working class would have to proceed to a radical settlement with the bourgeoisie and existing capitalist property relations. Lenin did not go that far until 1917, when confronted with the outbreak of the Russian Revolution, returning to Russia after 10 years, he put forward a perspective for the transfer of power to the working class, which was largely based on Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. And that is why in 1917, when Lenin returned in April, Lenin immediately fights for this perspective in his so-called April thesis and wins the Bolshevik Party over substantial opposition to this new perspective, which everyone recognized was essentially Trotsky's perspective. Trotsky returned 1 month later to Russia in May of 1917. He meets with Lenin. They agree that they no longer have any principal differences. And that was the beginning of their world historic collaboration. And Trotsky, in the aftermath of Lenin's death, emerged as the most vociferous defender of the fundamental principles of Bolshevism, as they have been defined by Lenin in the struggle against war and in the conquest of power by the working class in 1917. There were two monumental figures, but again, Lenin died in 1924 at the very beginning of the bitter inter-party struggle that was to decide the fate of the Russian Revolution. And in the last months of his politically active life, before he suffered a devastating stroke in March 1923, he turned to Trotsky for a political alliance in struggle against Stalin, in particular, who he defined as to use Lenin's words, a great Russian chauvinist bully. He was very hostile and was determined to remove Stalin from the position of general secretary. Now, Trotsky lived another 16 years, and so the responsibility for the conduct of the struggle against the degeneration of the Soviet Union under bureaucracy against the theory of socialism in one country was led by Trotsky. He went through that entire experience. Also, the colossal experiences and tragedies of the 1930s. And so socialism in the post-Leninist period was largely defined by the struggle of the Trotskyist movement, by the Fourth International, which was, in a revolutionary sense, the continuation of the first four congresses of the Third International, which had been founded at a time when both Lenin and Trotsky led the Russian Communist Party. So, but Trotsky is, as I said before, the question is dealt with by Trotsky are questions of our own time. The perspective of world socialist revolution, the struggle against bureaucracy, the fight against fascism. These are all the issues with which Trotsky grappled in the last 16 years of his life until his assassination by a Stalinist agent in Mexico in 1940. To be a socialist today is to be a Trotskyist.
My next question is related to the Makhno movement. The Makhno movement was an anarchist movement in Ukraine, and they, in the beginning, they were part of the Bolsheviks. Do you know why do they split, and what is the reason to assassinate Makhno, and why did they fight? I mean, yeah,
Well, I mean, again, I don't. The Bolsheviks didn't assassinate Makhno. I think Makhno emigrated. In the course of the Russian Revolution unleashed enormous social forces, particularly in the peasantry. The Bolshevik Party advanced a democratic program for the peasantry, but as all Marxists recognized, there always existed the potential of conflict to the extent of an objective character, because the aspirations of the peasantry were not necessarily socialistic. The peasants wanted land, private property to a certain extent, and the socialistic interests of the workers, the underlying conflict between agrarian and urban interests persisted. And so you had many sort of semi-anarchistic peasant movements which emerged during the period of the Civil War, often changing sides. The Bolsheviks, however, were able, and the Red Army was largely a peasant army, 5 million peasants, but which was politically directed by the working class and was able to retain a dominant position. But it was obviously, what I'm getting at, there were deep objective problems, and in fact that was a basic reason why the Bolsheviks recognized, or Lenin and Trotsky understood, that the problems of the Russian Revolution could not be solved on a purely national basis, that without the development of revolution beyond the borders of the Soviet Union, particularly in the advanced capitalist countries, the backwardness of Russian industry, the inability of to establish a necessary equilibrium between industry and agriculture, to the extent that Russian industry remained relatively backward, that always would remain a source of conflict between the working class and the peasantry. The left opposition founded by Trotsky sought to find a means to overcome these problems on a rational basis, and which, while prioritizing industry, understood that the peasantry could not be bludgeoned into supporting socialism, that there had to be very careful consideration given to the interests of the Russian peasantry. But this was done within the framework of a broader international policy. And Trotsky in particular opposed the theoretically ludicrous perspective of socialism in one country. Russia, on the basis of its own resources, cut off from the world market, cut off from advanced industry, simply could not build socialism. It required access to the resources of the world market, but it sought to achieve this through the development of socialist revolution, particularly in the advanced countries, but of course throughout the world.
I understand.
Makhno, by the way, Makhno was not murdered by the Bolsheviks. I think he died in France.
Okay. So I got it wrong. I remembered it this way, but okay, maybe I got it wrong. Many years ago, I read a book by Professor Anthony Sutton, and he wrote many books. But I believe I read 2 books. One about the Third Reich, and one about the Wall Street involvement and in the Bolshevik Revolution. It sounds a little bit like a conspiracy theory, and I'm not sure what
I'm not familiar with the book, but it sounds like a conspiracy theory. There's all sorts of right-wing tracts.
Yes, and his thesis
yeah,
was that National Socialism, Communism, and Liberal Capitalism are similar forms of strategy to modernize society, like experiments and like industrial development, but in different shapes and ways. And he showed that, for example, Lenin opened up to Wall Street and to the West in order to get his own.
These are politically illiterate books, and there's lots of things which are written.
Okay, thank you for the comment. Yes,
they're not serious books, and a lot of them have in fact, even a fascistic character to them, and generally based on falsifications of Trotsky and Lenin's politics.
I understand. So let's move on to maybe you wrote a book in 2016 called A Quarter Century of War, the US Drive for Global Hegemony. So what is the motive for the US, to invade other countries? I mean, first of all, it's expensive. Every war is expensive. People are dying, and you have to legitimate it, and you have to explain your own people why we are going to war. So why is this machinery even productive? Why is it still possible that we're in the 21st century and this is happening? I mean,
because the same issues fundamentally that led to the First and Second World War, imperialist wars for the redivision of the world, persist to this day. But Trotsky said in 1934, in a very important statement called War in the Fourth International, he said, Hitler wants to organize Europe. America wants to organize the world. One of the most striking manifestations of Trotsky's extraordinary prescience was his understanding that the major outcome of World War I was the emergence of the United States as the principal arbiter of the affairs of world capitalism. American money rebuilt European capitalism after the end of, or stabilized capitalism after the end of World War I, and certainly on an even bigger scale after World War II. The United States was in the wake of the wreckage of European capitalism by 1945. The United States was unquestionably the dominant economic military force. 75% of the gold reserve of the world was deposited in Fort Knox. And the monetary system, which was established as the basis of world trade in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference, essentially made the dollar the world reserve currency. The dollar was valued at gold, $35 an ounce. And because of the enormous global surplus, trade and budget, trade surpluses, and account surpluses of the United States, the dollar could be seen as being as good as gold. But of course, as the dominance of the United States eroded gradually in the course of the 1950s, and especially then more rapidly in the 1960s, budget deficits emerged and took ever greater magnitude. Trade surpluses turned into ever greater trade deficits. The authority of the dollar was eroded. And this objective decline was really registered in 1971 when the dollar cut loose from its earlier pledge to be redeemable into gold. That set into motion a protracted period of global economic instability, which persists to this day and which underlies many of the major crashes which we've experienced. But in a nutshell, The dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 encouraged the illusion or delusion that the end of the USSR somehow would lead almost automatically to a new epoch of unipolar global American global supremacy. That's not the way it turned out. The crises persisted, one war after another, in America's efforts to achieve through military means what it could not achieve economically, global supremacy. It was confronting challenges internationally, and of course, in particular, as we now see from the emergence of China, as a major economic competitor, which the United States is not prepared to accept. So it's really a struggle by the United States to maintain world supremacy or to achieve world supremacy, but this cannot be done peacefully. It can be done only through war. The United States, as I said, has been continuously at war for the last 30 years. The level of hypocrisy involved in its condemnations of Russia is staggering. They speak of unjustified, invasions of another country. I mean, what was the invasion of Iraq? The destruction of Libya, the war in Syria. I mean, how many countries has the United States intervened in virtually every hemisphere since 1991? And how many people has it killed as a consequence of the wars it has waged? I mean, we're talking about, in Iraq alone, well over 1 million people. Libya has been destroyed as a functioning society. Iraq has been destroyed. And it's no secret, if one reads the journals put out by these different think tanks, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and so on, the war in Russia is seen as nothing more than an entr'acte, a preliminary to the coming struggle with China. I mean, even as the war in Ukraine is being waged, just this morning, there's a report in the American media about how the largest submarine in the world from the United States arrived in South Korea, clearly an act of intimidation directed not just against North Korea, but as China itself. And the idiot commentator who was reporting this proclaims that on this submarine there are multiple nuclear missiles that have the power to blow up the planet. I mean, that's what the United States is up to. So what we are witnessing presently is a new imperialist war. The fact that European powers are backing this is because they hope that the destruction and carve up of Russia will give them part of the booty. I mean, after all, Russia is one of the great storehouses of vital natural resources. You don't read in the media anything about lithium, gold, silver, cobalt, molybdenum, timber. I mean, you name the rhodium, you name the resource and minerals, strategic minerals. Russia is a massive storehouse. If they can break up Russia, divide it into little bits and pieces, this wealth will, at least as the United States see it, reinvigorate American imperialism, and with various slops being handed off to the French, the British, the German. I should also add, by the way, that Germany's involvement in the war in the Ukraine is the third time in just over 100 years that Germany has been involved in a war in Ukraine. Yeah. Once again, German panzers move east. I think this should be a matter of concern. So this is an imperialist war, and one which we oppose. There's nothing democratic about the war. I should also add that the claim that the invasion of Ukraine is unprovoked is absurd. There's no such thing as an unprovoked war. Every war has a complex history, causal history, NATO has expanded 800 miles to the east and clearly poses an existential threat to Russia. Our opposition to the Putin's invasion is based on our opposition to the nationalist policies which he represents. He is the leader of a capitalist oligarchic regime. The problems which confront Russia cannot be resolved through endless entanglement in wars that will be waged with horrific consequences. We are for the unity of the Russian and Ukrainian working class, and it is only through that unity that this war can be stopped. And there is certainly a strong sentiment within both Russia and Ukraine for an ending of the war. The war is not popular in either country. There's a vast section of the Ukrainian population which recognizes that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was catastrophic and realized that they're not fighting for democracy. Those who run policy in Ukraine are a corrupt group of oligarchs. And of course, the oligarchs who run Russia are no better. So our policy is based on a fight for the international unity, which finds its expression in opposition of Russian, Ukrainian, and European workers as a whole to this war, the demand that it end, but it should not end with the destruction of Russia. And that can only be stopped through the independent political mobilization of the Russian working class, and the Ukrainian working class. That's our policy.
Prior to the interview, when we spoke, I mentioned that I saw an article from you published in 2014 that you predicted the war. And then you said that you wrote an article even before that in 91. And you held even a lecture in October 91 in Kiev. That you mentioned all the factors that could lead to a war after the break of the Soviet Union. Please explain, how could you predict the war, and which factors led to this war that, you could see that many left-wing couldn't see and many other analysts couldn't see?
Well, that's the great advantage of being a Trotskyist and being able to base oneself on the extraordinary theoretical work of this political genius, who, by the way, wrote extensively on the question of Ukraine, but wrote from a socialist and not a bourgeois national standpoint. Now, what you're referring to, between 1989 and 1991, that is the last period of the existence of the Soviet Union, I did travel several times to the Soviet Union. I spoke both in Moscow and also in Kiev. There were tremendous illusions, particularly in 1991. There was a sharp change. In 1989, one still encountered, there was a very large layer of people who still believed that somehow perestroika and glasnost would lead to a renewal of socialism, but there was tremendous interest in Trotsky, and the lies were breaking down. I gave a lecture in Moscow, which was announced, and within 24 hours, it was a very large audience, anxious to find out about the significance of the struggle waged by Trotsky. In 1991, when I was in Kiev, by that point, it was fairly clear that, and we have been warning of this since 1986, 87, that Gorbachev's policies would lead to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But at any rate, there were tremendous illusions about what capitalism would bring. That if there were capitalism, the streets would be paved with gold, there would be universal prosperity, Russia would be welcomed into the community of nations, everyone would be immensely happy, democracy would bloom, and so on. I mean, they believed lock, stock, and barrel the pro-capitalist propaganda that was flooding the country. Anyway, I held a number of lectures, and at one, it was at a workers' club in Kiev, and it was in October 1991. And I took up the issue of the implications of the dissolution of the USSR, and that the resurgence of national conflict, and warned very directly that the outcome of this was that there would not be genuine national independence. The fragments of the former the national fragments or ethnic fragments of the USSR would be set against each other by imperialist powers who would manipulate all the economic and political conflicts, that Ukraine would once again become a vassal of one or another imperialist power. And that's exactly what happened. And what happened in Ukraine is a continuation of what we saw in following the breakup of Yugoslavia and the conflict between Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia. By the way, I should make the point about NATO's insistence on the inviolability of borders. Serbia was broken up, Yugoslavia was broken up, Kosovo was extracted from Serbia, and power was turned over to a gang, which even the Europeans now admit were a bunch of drug dealers, the so-called Kosovan Liberation Army. In any event, yes, we foresaw this, and this war ultimately is the outcome of the dissolution of the USSR. And it's had already horrifying consequences. NATO presents itself as an ally of Ukraine. Well, as they say, with allies like that, who needs enemies? The number of dead, the number of Ukrainian soldiers killed are well over 250,000. I've seen figures as high as 350,000. There's been a massive loss of life. And the killing will continue. The United States is determined that this war go on. They continue to supply weapons to Ukraine. They do not want any negotiated settlement. The latest being the supply of cluster bombs. And now, of course, the Russians are using them as well. And so this bloodbath continues. And inevitably, as this war continues, more and more countries will be drawn into its maelstrom. And this will not just be a Russian-Ukrainian conflict, this will be a global conflict. That is the danger which confronts humanity.
Absolutely, yes. We can see that. And I saw an interview with Wagenknecht and Gaub and Francis, I don't know, a military woman, a military expert. And she stated, she criticized Wagenknecht for being, for peace. And she said, no, the contrary is right. We need to escalate in order to find peace. And this is the mainstream and the dominant narrative also here in Austria. I can see it. Prior to the International Summit for Peace for Ukraine held in Vienna a few weeks ago, I saw how the mainstream media reacted to this peace conference. They said Putin propaganda and so on and so forth. So media and I got the impression that politics is driving us to escalation, and this is the only solution. It's
unless our solution is the development of a massive global anti-war movement, which connects the struggle against war to the struggle against capitalism, for the unification of the working class, and under the influence of the working class, all progressive elements within society, principled intellectuals, artists, sections of the middle class, they should rally behind the working class to put an end to this war.
Absolutely.
I must now ask that you relieve me of my responsibility for the interview. I must go on to other work which I have scheduled for today.
So yeah, I had no further question, and I thank you very much for this debate and for this conversation, and I learned a lot, and I should read more Trotsky. To be quite honest, I never read something. I read Lenin.
The benefit of reading, the benefit of reading Trotsky is, first of all, you are reading the works of the greatest political thinker of the 20th century. He is also, and I must stress this, one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. Trotsky was a masterful writer. One last point, I'm very, very pleased that I will be attending an event which is being held in Principo on the 20th of August. Now, Trotsky spent 4 years in exile in Principo between 1929 and 1933. Actually, it was just almost exactly 90 years ago this week that Trotsky left Principo and traveled to France, where he was his second exile after being expelled from the Soviet Union. It will take place under the title An Island at the Center of World History, Trotsky in Principo, 1929 to 1933. But while he was in Principo, Trotsky wrote monumental works of political writing and of world literature. His autobiography, My Life, the monumental history of the Russian Revolution, which is one of the truly gigantic works of 20th century literature. And he wrote his remarkable political essays warning the German and international working class of the danger posed by the rise of Nazism. And these are truly great and works which remain enormously timely today when we see a resurgence of fascism. So I urge, yes, Joseph, by all means, you should read Trotsky, study him very, very carefully, and also read the World Socialist website every single day and its literature. And I hope it will contribute to your own clarification on vital political questions.
And I want to recommend the YouTube videos. You did an interview with Peter Ross on fascism, for example, on the rise of Hitler, and many lectures and book reviews. And yeah, this is also recommended.
I'm going to give your readers, go to wsws.org, and we have to read the World Socialist website. Also, you can access through the World Socialist website our publications, Mehring books at mehring.com, but you can access Mehring as well. And there you can see all the different literature which we make available and which you can purchase online.
Nice. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Joseph. All the best to you. Bye-bye.